Honourable Senators, members of the House of Commons, fellow Canadians, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs. Chaque jour, des millions de gens sur la
Every
planète
day,
font face à des
millions
fléaux
of
qui
people
mettent
on the
l'âme
planet
humaine à
are
l'épreuve.
faced with
Conditions météo
despair,
extrêmes, incendies ravageurs,
whether
pauvreté,
they're natural
conflits,
disasters,
discrimination
conflict,
et inégalité.
discrimination, or
Rarement
inequalities.
toutefois, l'humanité a-t-elle fait face
However,
à un ennemi
humanity
commun aussi
has never
insidieux,
faced
un ennemi
a single
invisible qui ne
enemy, an
respecte aucune
insidious
frontière,
enemy that respects no borders and spreads everywhere and can strike at any
To
time.
overcome a pandemic requires the work and resolve of every order of government, of every community, and of every one of us. We don't decide when hardship comes, but here in Canada, we have decided how we wanted to address it. We have adapted in remarkable ways. Nous, les Canadiens, avons fait notre part.
Canadians
Nous avons
have
changé nos
done our level
habitudes,
best. We have
reporté nos
changed
projets.
our habits,
Nous sommes passés
pushed
au
back our
télétravail
plans,
ou avons dû
and
complètement
began working
réinventer
from
notre
home
travail.
or
Tout cela en
restructured
prenant
our
soin
work,
les uns des autres.
all the while looking after each other.
Nous sommes immensément redevables
We
à ceux
are
qui ont servi et qui servent
immensely
encore en première
thankful
ligne, au
towards
personnel de la
essential
santé
workers,
et aux travailleurs
healthcare
essentiels,
workers,
aux femmes
and
et aux hommes
all
qui servent en
individuals on
uniforme,
the front
aux
line,
bénévoles et aux
for
dirigeants partout au
volunteers
pays.
and leaders from across the
There
country.
has been a lot of suffering, and we all mourn those who have passed. We trust science to lead the fight until a safe and effective vaccine becomes available. But until then, we must keep our guards up, using the tools that are available to us now, such as testing, treatments, and physical distancing measures. Like a reed in high winds, we may sway, but we will not break, because our roots are firmly in place, our goals clear, and because we have hope. The hope that lifts the soul on dark days and keeps us focused on the future. Les Canadiens ont déjà vécu des temps incertains et ont toujours
Canadians
démontré
have
que la
faced
détermination,
uncertainty in the
le souci
past
des
and have
autres,
always
le
shown
courage
that
et le
looking
bon
after
sens
each other,
définissent notre
courage,
nation.
and common sense
We
define
must
our
bring all
nation.
those qualities to bear once again and continue to work for the common good and for a better, safer, and more just society. This is who we are and what will see us through to brighter days. For over 150 years, parliamentarians have worked together to chart Canada's path forward. Your predecessors met when Confederation was only a few months old, setting the course for a young country. They stood united through Canada's toughest days, leading the nation through wars and depression. And as they did, each parliamentarian was called to meet their times. Today, Canadians expect you to do the same. They expect you to work together on their behalf and meet this crucial moment. Less than a year ago, we gathered here for a throne speech to open the 43rd Parliament. Since then, our realities have changed, and so must our approach. Over 9,000 Canadians have died in 6 months. For our neighbors in the United States, this figure is over 200,000. Globally, it's nearly 1 million. But these are not just numbers. These are friends and family, neighbors and colleagues. The pandemic is the story of parents who have died alone, without loved ones to hold their hands. It is the story of kids who have gone months without seeing friends, of workers who have lost their jobs. Les 6 derniers mois ont dévoilé les lacunes fondamentales de notre société et celles des sociétés du monde entier.
In our society, as elsewhere, this pandemic has been difficult on everyone. But for those who are already facing hardship, the burden is heaviest for parents and mothers, more specifically, that have faced difficult decisions between careers and children, for racialized Canadians and Indigenous individuals who face systematic problems, and youth who worry about the future, the elderly who are most exposed to risk and for those workers who earn the lowest wages and are the most precarious are on the front lines. We must address these issues without forgetting the future. The world entered this pandemic facing climate change and its risks. A lesson COVID-19 has taught us is that we must meet these challenges with determination. On all these fronts, healthcare, economy, equality, and the environment, we must act bravely. The government will do so.
The government's approach will have 4 foundations. The first foundation of this plan is to fight the pandemic and save lives. The second foundation of the government's plan is supporting people and businesses through this crisis as long as it lasts, whatever it takes. Effectively dealing with the health crisis is the best thing we can do for the economy. Government action has already helped Canadians stay safe and buffered the worst economic impacts. The third foundation is to build back better to create a stronger, more resilient Canada. To do this, we must keep strengthening the middle class and helping people working hard to join in and continue creating jobs and building long-term competitiveness with clean growth. We must also keep building safer communities for everyone. The fourth and final foundation of this plan is to stand up for who we are as Canadians. We cannot forget what has made us a country that is welcoming, a country that celebrates 2 official languages, that achieves progress on gender equality, walks the road of reconciliation, and fights discrimination of every kind. This is our generation's crossroads. Do we move Canada forward or let people be left behind? Do we come out of this stronger or paper over the cracks that the crisis has exposed? This is the time to remember who we are as Canadians. This is the opportunity to contain the global crisis and build back better together. The first foundation of the government's approach is protecting Canadians from COVID-19. This is priority number 1. It is the job of the federal government to look out for all Canadians, and especially for our most vulnerable. We need to work together because beating this virus is a Team Canada effort. Over the last 6 months, Canadians have stood united and strong. Their actions embody what has always been the purpose of the federal government, bringing Canadians together to achieve common goals. Personal protective equipment has been shipped across the country. Members of the Canadian Forces were there in long-term care homes. Close to 9 million Canadians were helped with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, and over 3.5 million jobs were supported by the wage subsidy. The government will continue to have people's backs, just like Canadians have each other's backs. Through the first wave, contact tracing and testing ramped up across the country. The surge this fall further reinforces what we already know, that we must do even more. The federal government will be there to help the provinces increase their testing capacity. Canadians should not be waiting in line for hours to get a test. Du même coup, le gouvernement examine toutes les technologies et toutes les options permettant d'offrir des tests plus rapides afin d'aider les Canadiens d'un océan à l'autre.
Options to help Canadians from coast to coast. Once it is approved in Canada, the government will do everything to implement these solutions, as well as intervention for screening to meet quickly the urgent needs in that respect, especially in remote and Indigenous communities. Local public health authorities are at the core of the efforts our country is deploying to fight outbreaks before they propagate. We are also mindful of the devastating economic impacts of the pandemic. In order to evit outbreaks extending further, communities may have to impose appropriate measures. In order to facilitate the task of public health authorities and reduce the impact of evidence-based decisions on local enterprises, the government will endeavor to provide additional financial assistance if companies have to close their doors temporarily because of government decisions. Such a measure will allow decisions to be made by placing the health of Canadians at the top of the list of priorities. The government will also continue to respond to all the needs of the community. To that end, the government has already invested over $19 billion as part of an accord with the provinces and territories in order to contribute to all efforts to reinforce health network capacities, including personal protection equipment. To remedy the difficulties encountered by provinces and territories during the back-to-school period, the federal government has invested billions of dollars in safe back-to-school programs, as well as additional funding for First Nations communities. Those funds will be used to ensure the safety of children and staff in classrooms, whether it be by helping schools purchase cleaning products or update their ventilation systems.
These commitments build on federal investment to support people who are most at risk and those who care for them, including with the federal wage top-up for personal support workers. People on the front lines who have been looking after seniors do vital work, and the government will continue to have their backs. At the same time, the government will continue to support Canadians as they take action to keep each other safe. Les gens font déjà leur part en portant un masque.
People are already doing their part by wearing a mask. And that is how we can further this effort in collaboration with private sector partners. The federal government has designed the COVID Alert app. People in Ontario, Newfoundland and Labrador, New Brunswick and Saskatchewan now have an additional tool to ensure their own safety and that of others. The government hopes that these tools will help shorten the pandemic so that everyone can do their part and be better protected. The government will continue trying to provide for personal protection equipment for Canadians as needed. Last spring, the government launched a call to Canadians, and Canadians responded. In many businesses, workers joined their efforts, and Canadian companies in less than 6 months started all types of equipment. The government will continue reinforcing that capacity by securing jobs. Supply chain. Canadians are mobilizing, whether it be by manufacturing equipment, by using the COVID Alert app, or by wearing a mask. Researchers and scientists in Canada are putting their expertise at the service of efforts against the pandemic. The best way to end this pandemic is to find a safe and effective vaccine. Canada's vaccine strategy aims to guarantee that Canadians can be vaccinated as soon as the vaccine will be approved. Types of vaccine candidates, Canada is exploring diverse options. The government has already ensured access to candidates and therapeutic products while pursuing development efforts here. In order to distribute vaccines to Canadians already, the government has made additional investments in its distribution capacity. Whether it be the working group vaccines, offers the best advice on purchasing and deploying vaccines, or the immunity working group, which deals with the effect of COVID-19 on health products. The greatest scientific minds of Canada are assisting the government at every step. The medical and scientific fight against this virus is crucial. just as those of Canadian workers and families. Therefore, the second pillar involves supporting Canadians in this pandemic. The economic repercussions of COVID-19 on Canadians are substantial, already worse than those of the 2008 financial crisis.
This is not the time for austerity. Canada entered this crisis in the best fiscal positions of its peers, and the government is using that fiscal firepower on things like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and on the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, so that Canadians, businesses, and our entire economy have the support needed to weather the storm. Canadians should not have to choose between health and their job, just like Canadians should not have to take on debt that their government can better shoulder. People losing their jobs is perhaps the clearest consequence of the global economic shock that Canadians, like those in other countries, have faced. The CERB helped people stay healthy at home while being able to keep food on the table. The CEWS helped people keep their jobs or be rehired if they had been laid off. But there is still more to be done. Unemployment is in the double digits, and underemployment is high. Women, racialized Canadians, and young people have borne the brunt of job losses. Canadians need good jobs that they can rely on. To help make that happen, the government will launch a campaign to create over 1 million jobs, restoring employment to previous levels. This will be done by using a range of tools, including direct investments in the social sector and infrastructure, immediate training to quickly skill up workers, and incentives for employers to hire and retain workers. One way the government will create these jobs is by extending the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy right through the next summer. The government will work with businesses and labor to ensure the program meets the needs of the health and economic situation as it evolves. Une autre façon pour le gouvernement de créer des emplois consistera à renforcer considérablement la stratégie emploi et compétences jeunesse.
Considerably strengthening its employment and skills strategy in order to create well-paid jobs for young Canadians. Today, more than ever, Canadians have to work together, especially by eliminating the last obstacles that impede full exchanges between provinces in order to relaunch the economy and Canadians back on their feet. With the efforts that Canadians have had to make, many of them have require assistance until they can return to work. But existing support systems have not been designed. Unusual situation, unprecedented situation. That is why the government quickly created a temporary emergency benefit program to help millions of Canadians meet the exigencies of a difficult period. Since the recovery is now well underway, benefit recipients will now switch to the employment insurance program for those who are not employment insurance. The government has temporarily created the Canadian recovery benefit over the coming months. The insurance program will become the only mechanism to distribute benefits based on pre-pandemic entitlements. This pandemic showed that Canada requires an employment insurance program adapted to the 21st century, gig economy and self-employed.
Women, and in particular low-income women, have been hit hardest by COVID-19. This crisis has been described as the she session. Many women have bravely served on the front lines of this crisis in our communities and by shouldering the burden of unpaid care work at home. We must not let the legacy of this pandemic be one of rolling back the clock on women's participation in the workplace, nor one of backtracking on the social and political gain women and allies have fought so hard to secure. The government will create an action plan for women in the economy. to help more women get back into the workforce and to ensure a feminist, intersectional response to this pandemic and recovery. This plan will be guided by a task force of experts whose diverse voices will power a whole-of-government approach. It has been nearly 50 years since the Royal Commission on the Status of Women outlined the necessity of childcare services for women's social and economic equality. We have long understood that Canada cannot succeed if half the population is held back. Canadians need more accessible, affordable, inclusive, and high-quality childcare. Recognizing the urgency of this challenge, the government will make a significant, long-term, sustained investment to create a Canada-wide early learning and childcare system. Le gouvernement tablera sur des investissements antérieurs.
The government
apprendra du modèle mis en place au Québec,
will extend early investments and learn from the model implemented so that high-quality childcare services be made accessible. All walks of life, including the leaders, agree to say that now is the time to act. Government will subsidize programs. Given the way this pandemic has affected parents and families, more important than ever, that flexible childcare arrangements be made available. Government accelerate the of the Women in Entrepreneurship strategy that has already helped Canadian women to develop. While investing in government will continue to help businesses create jobs. Small businesses are government has adopted a series of measures
allant de l'aide à la masse salariale par l'intermédiaire de la subvention salariale d'urgence du Canada, à l'aide aux dépenses par le biais de prêts sans intérêt.
Help with via
la COVID-19 a poussé les entreprises de tout le pays, grandes comme petites, à repenser leur façon de faire. Les entrepreneurs et les propriétaires se tournent davantage vers les solutions numériques, les solutions créatives et les investissements respectueux du climat.
Creative solutions
aidera les entreprises à s'adapter à l'avenir
that respect the climate. The government.
This fall, in addition to extending the wage subsidy, the government will take further steps to bridge vulnerable businesses to the other side of the pandemic by expanding the Canada Emergency Business Account to help businesses with fixed costs, by improving the Business Credit Availability Program, and by introducing further support for industries that have been the hardest hit, including travel and tourism, and cultural industries like the performing arts. This COVID-19 emergency has had huge costs, but Canada would have been in a deeper recession and in a bigger long-term deficit if the government had done less. With interest rates so low, central banks can only do so much to help. There is a global consensus that governments must do more. Government can do so while also locking in the low cost of borrowing for decades to come. This government will preserve Canada's fiscal advantage and continue to be guided by values of sustainability and prudence. There are two distinct needs. The first is to help Canadians in the short term, to do whatever it takes, using whatever fiscal firepower is needed to support people and businesses during the pandemic. The best way to keep the economy strong is to keep Canadians healthy. The second need is to build back better with a sustainable approach for future generations. As the government builds a plan for stimulus and recovery, this must be done responsibly. In the longer term, the government will focus on targeted investments to strengthen the middle class, build resiliency, and generate growth. The government will also identify additional ways to tax extreme wealth inequality, including by concluding work to limit the stock option deduction for wealthy individuals at large, established corporations, and addressing corporate tax avoidance by digital giants. Un constat s'impose. Les géants du web empochent l'argent des Canadiens et imposent leurs propres priorités. Les choses doivent changer et elles vont changer. Le gouvernement agira afin d'assurer un partage plus équitable de leurs revenus avec nos créateurs et médias, en plus d'exiger qu'ils contribuent à la création, à la production et à la diffusion de nos histoires, à l'écran, en parole, en musique, par écrit. Cet automne, le gouvernement rendra public une mise à jour du plan d'intervention économique du Canada pour répondre à la COVID-19. Il exposera la situation économique et financière du gouvernement, fournira des projections financières et présentera de nouvelles mesures visant à mettre en œuvre le présent discours du temps. Cette mise à jour établira clairement que la force de la classe moyenne et le bien-être de tous les Canadiens demeurent les principaux indicateurs remain the key. As we fight for every Canadian and defend everybody's ability to succeed, we also need to focus on the future and on building back better. This forms the third foundation of the government's approach. Around the world, advanced economies are realizing that things should not go back to business as usual. COVID-19 has exposed the vulnerabilities in our society. The government will create a resiliency agenda for the middle class and for people working hard to join it. This will include addressing the gaps in our social systems, investing in healthcare, and creating jobs. It will also include fighting climate change and maintaining a commitment to fiscal sustainability and economic growth as the foundation of a strong and vibrant society. Nous devons a priori reconnaître que l'un des plus grands drames de cette pandémie est la perte des vies humaines dans les centres de soins de longue durée. Tous les aînés méritent de vivre en sécurité, dans le respect et la dignité.
All of our elders
Même si les
deserve
soins
to
de
live
longue durée
safely
sont
with
de
respect and
compétence
dignity.
provinciale et
Although long-term
territoriale,
care is
le
a
gouvernement
provincial and
fédéral
territorial,
fera tout en son pouvoir pour
federal
soutenir
government
les
will do
personnes
all
âgées
in its
en
power
collaboration avec les
to support
provinces et les
our
territoires.
elders in collaboration with
Le
jurisdictions.
gouvernement travaillera avec le Parlement
Government
pour apporter
will
des
work with
modifications au
Parliament
code criminel
to amend the
afin
criminal
de
code
sanctionner de
in
manière
order
claire les personnes qui
to punish
négligent et
clearly
mettent en danger les
those
aînés
who
dont ils prennent
neglect
soin.
elders and put them
En
in
outre,
harm's way.
le
In addition,
gouvernement collaborera
the
avec les
government
provinces et les
will work
territoires
with provinces
en
and
vue d'établir de
territories,
nouvelles normes nationales pour les
establish
soins de longue
new
durée
national
afin que les
standards for
personnes
long-term
âgées
care
bénéficient du
so that
meilleur soutien possible.
the elderly the best support
Le
possible.
gouvernement aussi
The
prendra des
government
mesures
will
supplémentaires pour
also
aider
take
les gens à
additional
vivre
measures
chez eux plus
to
longtemps.
help home.
Enfin, le gouvernement reste déterminé
Finally,
à augmenter la
the
pension de
government
la
is
sécurité
determined
de la
to
vieillesse lorsqu'une personne âgée atteint 75 ans et à augmenter la prestation de survivants du régime des pensions du Canada. Le gouvernement étudiera également d'autres mesures visant expressément les préposés aux services de soutien à la personne, qui offrent un service essentiel aux gens les plus vulnérables de nos communautés. Le Canada doit mieux valoriser leur travail et leur contribution à notre société. La COVID-19 touche de façon démesurée les Canadiens en situation de handicap et a mis en lumière des problèmes qui durent depuis longtemps. Le gouvernement présentera son plan pour l'inclusion des personnes handicapées, lequel prévoit une nouvelle prestation canadienne pour les personnes en situation de handicap qui sera inspirée du supplément de revenus garanti destiné aux autres, une stratégie d'emploi robuste qui ciblera les Canadiens en situation de handicap et un meilleur processus pour déterminer l'admissibilité au programme et aux prestations du gouvernement qui visent les personnes en situation de handicap. Over the last 6 months, it has become clearer than ever, why Canadians need a resilient healthcare system. The government will ensure that everyone, including in rural and remote areas, has access to a family doctor or primary care team. COVID-19 has also shown that our system needs to be more flexible and able to reach people at home. The government will continue to expand capacity to deliver virtual health care. The government will also continue to address the opioid epidemic tearing through communities, which is an ongoing and worsening public health crisis. Additionally, the government will further increase access to mental health resources. All Canadians should have the care they need when they need it. We will all be stronger for it. The same goes for access to the medicine that keeps people healthy. Many Canadians who had drug plans through work lost this coverage when they were laid off because of the pandemic. So this is exactly the right moment to ramp up efforts to address that. The government remains committed to a national universal pharmacare program and will accelerate steps to achieve this system, including through a rare disease strategy to help Canadian families save money on high-cost drugs, establishing a national formulary to keep drug prices low, and working with provinces and territories willing to move forward without delay. En plus d'une bonne infrastructure de santé, les Canadiens doivent pouvoir s'épanouir dans les communautés fortes et sécuritaires.
Must have an ability to settle in strong communities. The government intends to ban assault-style firearms and will continue to implement its commitments in respect of firearms control. In particular, provide municipalities with the ability to further restrict or ban measures to control the influx of illegal firearms in Canada. The safety of women must be the core of any program. The government will enhance investments in transition housing and shelters and will continue the implementation of national measures against sexist violence. In order to reinforce communities further, the government will invest in all types of infrastructure over the next 2 years. It will invest in transit, environmentally friendly renovations, energy, wide broadband service in rural areas, and affordable housing especially for Aboriginal communities. For the past few months, many people have started working from home. Taking classes on their kitchen table, shopping online, and accessing government services remotely. It is more important than ever that all Canadians have access to internet. The government will accelerate the implementation of connectivity and will enhance its universal broadband fund ambition so that Canadians in all regions have access to broadband. And in order to tighten the links between our communities, the government will work with partners to ensure regional schedules for airlines. It is essential that Canadians living in remote regions have access to reliable and affordable regional air service with the question of equity, employment, and economic development. The government will work to that end.
Strong communities are places where everyone has a safe, affordable home. No one should be without a place to stay during a pandemic, and for that matter, a Canadian winter. This week, the government invested more than $1 billion for people experiencing homelessness, including for this fall. In 2017, the government announced that it would reduce chronic homelessness by 50%. The government has already helped more than 1 million people get a safe and affordable place to call home. Given the progress that has been made and our commitment to do more, the government is now focused on entirely eliminating chronic homelessness in Canada. At the same time, the government will also make substantial investment in housings for Canadians. The government will add to the historic National Housing Strategy announced in 2017 by increasing investment to rapid housing in the short term and partnering with not-for-profit and co-ops in the mid to long term. For the middle class, the government will also move forward with enhancement to the first-time home buyer incentive, including in Canada's largest cities, so families can afford to buy their first home. Tout le monde mérite d'avoir un toit au-dessus de la tête.
Everyone deserves a roof over their head, and housing is a key engine of the economy. Construct, create employment, and when people have a home, they are better able to contribute to their community. Just as everyone deserves a home, everyone deserves to be able for their family. Because of the pandemic, this has become more difficult for Canadians. The government, working with partners, including directly with First Nations, Inuit, at food insecurity in Canada. The government will also reinforce local food supply chains. Migrant workers who process our crops, from fruit pickers, seafood processors, have made a remarkable job in putting food on people's. The government will also ensure that workers in the time management sector receive equitable compensation. Our families are fed thanks to our farm workers, and we will continue to help. This pandemic has revealed gaps in our health systems, our housing, our food supply. It has also highlighted inequalities that Canadians face on the labor market. An opportunity not only to support Canadians, but also to potential. In collaboration with provinces and territories, the government will invest significantly, more than ever, train workers. This investment aims to support Canadians who acquire new skills, growth sectors, to help workers receive training and obtain accreditation, and to reinforce future workers by placing good employers and good jobs in order to help the growth.
From researchers developing vaccines to entrepreneurs building online stores, this pandemic has reminded us of the power of the knowledge economy and how vital it is for our future. Canadians are leading, and they should have government services that keep up. The government will make generational investments in updating outdated IT systems to modernize the way that government serves Canadians, from the elderly to the young, from people looking for work to those living with a disability. The government will also work to introduce free, automatic tax filing for simple returns to ensure citizens receive the benefits they need. Government must remain agile and ready for what lies ahead. Climate action will be a cornerstone of our plan to support and create 1 million jobs across the country. This is where the world is going. Global consumers and investors are demanding and rewarding climate action. Canadians have the determination and ingenuity to rise to this challenge and global market opportunity. We can create good jobs today and a globally competitive economy, not just next year, but in 2030, 2040, and beyond.
Canadians are aware that climate change threatens their health, their lifestyle, and their planet. They want climate change and climate action now, and that the government will continue to provide. The government will immediately implement a plan to overshoot Canada's climate objectives for 2030. The government will also legislate on Canadians' goal 50. As part of its plan, Canada and following measures, creating thousands of jobs in energy bills, fight for catastrophes such as floods and forest fires in order to make resilient, promote the implementation of more or that zero-emission vehicles are more best in the country. A good example of working to of zero-emission batteries. Nickel, copper, Canada has the resources necessary for this clean future. Together with Canada's technology, they are a competitive advantage for our country. The government will undertake a new fund in order to attract investments in the manufacturing of zero-emission products and will reduce by half the emission rate for those companies in order to create jobs and to make Canada a world leader in clean technology. The government will seek to make Canada the most competitive destination in the world for clean. The government will also take measures that we fuel our economy and our communities by going forward with clean energy funds, especially projects such as the Atlantic Loop that will provide energy supplies to companies that abandon coal, and supporting investment in renewable energies and clean energy solutions and technology for the next generation.
Canada cannot reach net zero without the know-how of the energy sector and the innovative ideas of all Canadians, including people in places like British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland and Labrador. The government will support manufacturing, natural resource, and energy sectors as they work to transform to meet a net zero future, creating good-paying and long-lasting jobs. And it will recognize farmers, foresters, and ranchers as key partners in the fight against climate change, supporting their efforts to reduce emissions and to build resilience. The government will continue its policy of putting a price on pollution while putting that money back in the pockets of Canadians. It cannot be free to pollute. This pandemic has reminded Canadians of the importance of nature. The government will work with municipalities as part of a new commitment to expand urban parks so that everyone has access to green space. This will be done while protecting a quarter of Canada's land and a quarter of Canada's oceans in 5 years, and using nature-based solutions to fight climate change, including by planting 2 billion trees. The government will ban harmful single-use plastics next year and ensure more plastic is recycled. And the government will also modernize Canada's Environmental Protection Act. When the Prairie Farm Rehabilitation Administration was closed by a previous government, Canada lost an important tool to manage its waters. The government will create a new Canada Water Agency to keep our water safe, clean, and well managed. The government will also identify opportunities to build more resilient water and irrigation infrastructure. At the same time, the government will look at continuing to grow Canada's ocean economy to create opportunities for fishers and coastal communities, while advancing reconciliation and conservation objectives. Investing in the blue economy will help Canada prosper.
We are waging this fight for today's Canadians and for the Canada of tomorrow. We must therefore never forget the values that define us, and this is the fourth and final pillar of the government's approach, defending Canada's value, that all can benefit from them. In Canada, we take care of each other. That is what has helped our country deal the pandemic better than many others. Canada must continue to defend the values that define it, whether it be welcoming
ou de célébrer ces 2 langues officielles. Il reste encore du travail à faire, notamment sur le chemin de la réconciliation, dans la lutte contre le racisme systémique. Tout au long de la pandémie, le gouvernement s'est fixé comme priorité de soutenir les communautés autochtones, ce qui a permis de contenir la propagation de la COVID-19 et de garantir la sécurité des gens. Le gouvernement poursuivra ses efforts en ce sens. The government will walk the shared path of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and remain focused on implementing the commitments made in 2019. However, the pandemic has shown that we need to keep moving forward even faster on a number of fronts including by expediting work to co-develop distinction-based Indigenous health legislation with First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation, and a distinction-based mental health and wellness strategy. By accelerating work on the National Action Plan in response to the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, calls for justice, as well as implementation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. And by continuing to close the infrastructure gap in Indigenous community, working on a distinction basis with First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation to accelerate the government's 10-year commitment. The government will also make additional resiliency investment to meet the clean drinking water commitment in First Nations community and support additional capacity building for First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation. The government will also move forward to introduce legislation to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples before the end of this year. Pour trop de Canadiens, le racisme systémique est une réalité bien présente.
Too many Canadians, systemic racism is an reality. We know that racism did not take a break during the pandemic. To the contrary, COVID-19 struck disproportionately racialized Canadians. Many people, including Indigenous, Black, and racialized Canadians, have asked loud and clear for change. They tell us that we must do more. The government agrees. The government has promised to attack systemic racism based on the lived experiences of racialized.
The government has invested in economic empowerment through the Black Entrepreneurship Program, while working to close the gaps in services for Indigenous communities. Important steps were taken with the release of Canada's anti-racism strategy for 2019 to 2022, the creation of an anti-racism secretariat, and the appointment of the first ever minister focused specifically on diversity and inclusion. This is all good, but much more needs to be done for permanent, transformative change to take place. The government will redouble its effort by taking action on online hate, going further on economic empowerment for specific communities, and increasing diversity on procurement, building a whole of federal government approach around better collection of disaggregated data, implementing an action plan to increase representation in hiring and appointments, and leadership development within the public service, and by taking new steps to support the artistic and economic contributions of Black Canadian culture and heritage. Progress must also be made through the policing and justice systems. All Canadians must have the confidence that the justice system is there to protect them, not to harm them. Black Canadians and Indigenous peoples are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. That has to change. The government will take steps to ensure that a strong hand of criminal justice is used where it is needed to keep people safe, but not where it would be discriminatory or counterproductive. The government will introduce legislation and make investments that take action to address the systemic inequities in all phases of the criminal justice system, from diversion to sentencing, from rehabilitation to records. The government will move forward on enhanced civilian oversight of our law enforcement agencies, including the RCMP. It will modernize training for police and law enforcement, including addressing standards around the use of force. It will move forward on RCMP reforms with a shift toward community-led policing. And it will accelerate work to co-develop a legislative framework for First Nations policing as an essential service. Our
two official languages are an indispensable part of our country's heritage. defending the rights of Francophone minorities outside Quebec and the Anglophone minority in Quebec are a priority for the government. But the Government of Canada must also recognize the challenge as being particular. There are almost 8 million Francophones in Canada in an ocean of almost. The government has a responsibility to protect and promote French, not merely outside Quebec, but also. To that end, 51 years, the government is undertaking to reinforce the law by taking in French.
Immigration remains a driver of Canada's economic growth. With other countries rejecting global talent that could help their economy, Canada has an opportunity, as we recover, to become the world's top destination for talent, capital, and jobs. When people choose Canada, help build Canada, and make sacrifices in support of Canada, we should make it easier for them to formally become Canadians. Earlier this year, the government announced measures to grant permanent residency to people who, although not Canadian citizens, had cared for the most vulnerable in long-term care homes and other medical facilities. The government will continue to bring in newcomers and support family reunification. We know that there is an economic and human advantage to having families together. As part of both the short-term economic recovery and of a long-term plan for growth, the government will leverage the advantage we have on immigration to keep Canada competitive on the world stage. Nous devons donner suite à toutes ces priorités au pays.
Implement all those priorities for the country, but we must also live in. COVID-19 has accelerated the fragmented world order. It remains in Canada's interests to forge bilateral and multilateral relationships. The government will invest more in international development and will help developing countries. Resilience. Canada will also. Our world to a vaccine. We cannot eliminate this pandemic in Canada if we cannot eliminate it everywhere in the world.
The government will also continue to stand up for human rights and the rule of law. It is unacceptable that any citizen be arbitrarily detained. Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor must be brought home. This is something for which all Canadians stand united. The government will continue to fight for free trade, including by leading the Ottawa Group to reform the World Trade Organization. Our like-minded allies and partners are investing to make sure their societies emerge stronger. This government's plan does that as well. Taken together, this is an ambitious plan for an unprecedented reality. The course of events will determine what needs to be done when. But throughout, protecting and supporting Canadians will stay the top priority. And the core values that have driven the government since day one will remain the same. In 2015, Canadians asked their government to deliver real change on everything from middle-class jobs to climate change. In 2019, the people chose a parliament that would keep moving forward on these shared goals. And in 2020, Canadians expect nothing less. It is no small task to build a stronger, more resilient country. It will take hard work. It will require a commitment to finding common ground. Mesdames et messieurs, les parlementaires,
ladies and gentlemen, parliamentarians, Canadians count on you to keep moving this country forward. I expect you to work together to meet the challenges that confront us. Remember that we are here today thanks to the generations of Canadians that preceded us. We are here today thanks to the men and women, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, who had the courage to aspire to a better future. Today, it's our turn. We have a chance to build a stronger and more resilient Canada for all. Ladies and gentlemen, you will be called upon to vote the necessary supply to finance. Senators and members of Parliament, may you be worthy of the confidence vested in you by Canadians, and may Providence guide you in the exercise of your functions.